So I had a radio consultant say one time and tell me I was doing it all wrong. Contacted me and said, listen to your show. You're doing it all wrong. The show needs to be more about you. You need to talk more. You should never let your guest talk for more than 2 minutes. You need to put in your 2 cents. People need to go away and they need to know that this is your show. And I completely rejected all of that advice because the show is not about my trip and it's not about my guest's trip. It's about my listener's trip.
Welcome to the Podcasting Secret Show, where successful creators share their best stories, secrets, and strategies. I'm your host, Nathan William.
Hello, incurable creators, and welcome to this episode of the Podcasting Secret Show. Today, I'm joined by Christensen. Chris is the host and producer of Amateur Traveler and the Bible Study Podcast. Chris is a veteran podcaster. He's been podcasting since 2005. He has more than 900 episodes covering destinations on all 7 continents. That's pretty impressive, in more than 50 countries. He's an award-winning journalist. He's received the Travel and Leisure Smitty Award for Best Independent Travel Journalist. Thank you so much for being with us today, Chris.
Well, thanks for having me.
Chris,
and we should say, when you said over 900 episodes, that's for Amateur Traveler. Over the years, I've done 4 or 5 different podcasts, so I have more than 2,000 episodes. I've lost.
Wow! Oh. Congratulations, that's a lot. Chris, can you start off by sharing with us something that not everybody knows about you?
Something that not everybody knows about me. Well, I'm a little older than you made me there. I've actually got 43 years experience in high tech. So let's just get that out of the way. So I've been around Silicon Valley for a while. I'm a Silicon Valley nerd. So that is something that my Silicon Valley friends know, but is not necessarily something that has come up in the podcasting circles that I hang out with. So that is a key part of my personality, is I'm a nerd.
I love it.
That is not a secret. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a nerd. But
how has that helped you in your podcasting journey?
Well, when I started podcasting, so I started coming up on 20 years. So I started in July 2nd of 2005. That was before there were a lot of tools. I was hand editing RSS feeds back in the day, which is something, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just be glad. Yeah. It's not something you want to do, but that helped me get started at a time when the tools really weren't as easy as they are today to start a podcast.
Yeah.
And making a website, I've been paid to make websites since the web was steam driven back in the late 90s. So that's not something that's difficult for me to do.
Yeah. Since the late 90s, doing websites and doing podcasting since 2005, you're truly one of those pioneers. Tell us a couple more of the things that have changed the most since those early days.
Well, people are listening. I mean, just the most significant difference is that really there was no listenership back in 2005. And we've watched the curve of how many people even know what a podcast is, go up and to the right almost every year since then. But it was the Wild West. I mean, there really weren't that many shows. I remember deciding when I was trying to figure out what podcast to do that I didn't want to do a Mac show because there already was one. One. I literally knew about one show about the Mac and decided not to get into that space because of that. Well, there's a few more than one right now. So it was pretty small back then.
Yeah, can you imagine if you had been number 2? And probably number 1 is not in existence anymore. Is number 1?
The first one that I knew about was MacCast by Adam Christensen, not the same spelling, but a brother from another mother. He stopped podcasting this year, I think it was. So he went on for 19 years and then gave it up. So there's a lot of people who started back in those days who are no longer podcasting for various reasons.
Yeah. Okay, can you tell us about your podcasting journey? What's your story?
Sure. Well, I started podcasting because I discovered podcasting really early on. So podcasting started in September of 2004. The very first, RSS feed combined with an audio show, which was the Podfather, was Adam Curry's show. That came out in September, as I understand, of 2004. I started listening by about December of that year, when one of the TV shows, a nerd TV show that I was listening to, which was Call for Help out of Canada with Leo Laporte, they got canceled, and they said, well, we're going to do a podcast instead. And that was my what's a podcast moment. Yeah, a lot of us who were in podcasting had that moment. For some, it was, it showed up on your iPhone, or for some it showed up in iTunes, or for some it was some particular show you like that was recommended, but that was mine. And so I decided fairly early on, by, sometime in spring of 2005, that I wanted to do my own show, and thought about, as I said, thought about doing a tech show, thought about doing a religious show, which I did then start a year later. But then we had a bunch of friends over for Memorial Day picnic, and all the best stories were travel stories. And I said, I'm going to do a show about my travels, which was a really stupid idea, because I was working a full-time job. I was traveling 4 weeks a year and podcasting 48 weeks a year. So the show very quickly turned into a show about other people's travels. It turned into an interview show, which is one of the reasons why I was able to keep it going, mostly with a full-time job then, for 19 years before I retired from my tech job.
Wow, you were able to do a travel show without traveling.
Without doing a lot of travel at first. Yeah, I've done more travel since. I probably started the show, and this is just embarrassing to say, when I had been to less than a dozen countries, or maybe around a dozen countries, which, was more than a lot of my friends. But it's, I now know at least two people who've been to every country, every UN, officially recognized country. And so that is just embarrassing to think about that now. But it actually didn't matter, because I wasn't necessarily the expert. I was bringing on the experts to talk about destinations.
That's true. And you probably were able to cover a lot more destinations in a lot more depth than you could have covered if you had to do all the traveling yourself.
Oh my gosh, you'd kill yourself trying to do all that kind of travel.
Interesting. You probably freed yourself up by not being the travel expert.
It turns out, yeah. Although it was funny when you say not being the travel expert. So a few years after,
I meant the expert at every.
No, it's a very legitimate thing to say. But the funny thing was, I think it was 5 to 10 years after that, I was invited to speak at the New York Times travel show on a panel of guidebook authors. Basically, what's the future of guidebooks, the travel guidebooks? And I went, well, I haven't written a guidebook, and they said, yeah, we know. We just want your opinion. And so the funny thing with interview-based shows is that, if you are a good interviewer, if you are learning things along the way, is you, in some ways, acquire some of the expertise of the people you bring on.
Yeah.
And I really think that that's how I got invited to that, is that I had in some ways, appropriated some of that expertise and was seen as an expert in an area that I don't think I'm an expert. I don't think there's any good reason to think I'm an expert in that area, but it was just made me laugh.
So just by having a podcast, you became an industry leading expert.
Yeah, industry leading is a little strong there, but that's what they were thinking. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
yeah, for sure.
And that was before I, won an award as best independent travel journalist, or was, this year voted into the Hall of Fame for podcasting, which in other news, there's a podcasting Hall of Fame. So,
so how many downloads do you think you've had across your episodes?
I don't know. I don't know, because I've been hosted at a number of different places since then. When I started hosting, I was literally hosting on an old Mac Quadra 400 megahertz machine that was sitting in my office until I was first featured by iTunes in the podcast, the podcast they featured, which was in fall of 2005, when basically I was away at the very first podcasting conference that I was aware of, and they happened to feature me, and that machine did all but catch fire. And so I, quickly found I was a VP of engineering, executive VP of engineering and operations for a web company at the time. So my boss let me host it there for a while. But then I went with, a company called Fruitcast that went out of business. And then I went with Mevio, who was started by the very first podcaster. And, that was with Libsyn for years. And now I'm at another host. So I've lost track of the numbers. But these days I get somewhere between for just Amateur Traveler, somewhere between 1.7 million and 2 million a year downloads. And then these days, Bible Study Podcast and Amateur Traveler go back and forth any particular month, which one gets more downloads. So I think last month, Bible Study Podcast was larger, and the month before, Amateur Traveler was larger. So I get somewhere around 3.5 million downloads to 4 million downloads a year.
Can you share with us roughly how much revenue you generate from your shows?
So the revenue from everything I do, because I'm a podcaster and a blogger, is approaching about 100 million, I wish, 100,000 a year. This may hit 100,000 here in this fiscal year. We have formed a corporation, and so our fiscal year will end in September. And so it'll be somewhere in the 90s to 100,000 this year. But that, I can do the breakdown for you if you're interested.
Sure.
The number one source of revenue is podcast advertising on Amateur Traveler. That tends to run in the range of about $3,000 to $5,000 a month, somewhere in that range. And that's being sold by a company on my behalf by Glassbox. Reps made on that. The number two source is Unusual. The Amateur Traveler is syndicated to airlines. By a partner who does all the work. And that tends to run about $1,300 a month. Ads on Bible Study Podcasts, somewhere in the $8,000 to $1,000 range. Blog ads on Amateur Traveler and California version of Amateur Traveler tends to run about $800 a month. Patreon runs about $300. Ads on Hotel Scoop, which is another website I bought, runs about $600. So it kind of all adds up.
Yeah.
I did a tour this year. That tour will probably net me about $4,000. But, I've had other tours where I lost money on or whatever. But this one happened to be very popular. Listeners to the show voted on where we go every year, and they voted on Cuba this year. And so I took a group of 17 of us, counting me and my wife and I and some friends, to Cuba in February. And so with a regular tour operator, as anyone can do, you don't need to be a travel podcaster or blogger to do that sort of trip. You just work with a group office to do that. So that's kind of, you have to have lots of different revenue streams to add up to that kind of money.
Yeah. So you've been around a long time. What is your secret to being able to have that kind of longevity for your shows?
I still like what I'm doing. And that is, you can't underestimate that, right? That I'm still enjoying it because, remember, I said I've done other shows. And so I did one show that was also in the travel space that was called This Week in Travel for about 10 years before I opted out. And I still enjoyed every time we got together and recorded, but the coordinating, getting together with 2 or 3 other hosts, and we weren't making any money on it, and I was doing all the production work, and it just, at some point, there was no joy in it for me. It had done what it was going to do for me. And the main reason we started that show was to Gary Arndt, who was the person who approached me and said, hey, Chris, should we do a podcast together? He intended that we raised our visibility within the travel publishing community. And so, become more well-known to travel editors, for instance, at the time. And it was successful with that. Basically, in 2013, he won the Smitty Award for the Best Independent Travel Journalist, and I won it in 2014. That is entirely because of that podcast. And so,
Interesting.
yeah, that was how we both became known to people who we know were judges for that contest. So, and then I also did another show that I stopped when I went back to work full time. I was doing contracting for about 6 years, so I had some additional time to travel and to do more things. And so, yeah, number one is just do something that you don't get tired of. But then two is do something that other people don't get tired of, right? If you're doing it for a long time and you get no audience, obviously there's no joy there either. And it isn't necessarily the money. That this kind of 100K is real fun, but it's not what I've made most of the time. I remember years where I was making, including the blog and things like that, 27,000 or something like that.
Right.
And I would say that was more typical for most of the years I've been doing this. And some years I was making nothing or almost nothing, and wasn't getting opportunities. That's the other thing to be aware of with Amateur Traveler is there's the money, and then there's also the emails, and the emails that say things like, hey, I'm with United Airlines. This is one I got in January. It said, we love your podcast. We'd really like you to talk about our business class offering on our planes as an independent traveler traveling internationally. Where do you want to go? So, those are the opportunities that you get. So I'm doing sponsored trips this year. I mentioned Cuba, which is a little different because I put that together rather than getting sponsored. But I was in Dubai. I was just in Japan on a sponsored trip doing a walk with Walk Japan. I'm off to raft the Grand Canyon on a sponsored trip coming up. I'm going to a conference where it's all expenses paid to Colorado for the Adventure Travel Trade Association. I'm going to China with the Society of American Travel Writers, paid for by China. And then I'm doing a trip with Intrepid, going down to all the countries in Central America in July. So this only gets me like to late August, and there's other things happening after that. So
wow.
So that's the other thing with what I have decided to do is, because I talk about destinations want me to talk about them. And that's somewhat intentional. I tell people that when you're putting together your podcast, think about what you want to get out of it. Think about what other people want to get out of it. What is your audience looking for? And then, your content has to match that. So I had a friend, for instance, who said, what are you to start a podcast for? Well, I'm doing a travel podcast where I'm interviewing travel bloggers about why travel is cool. Okay. Well, what do you want to get out of it? I want to get invited to places. You don't talk about places. Why is anybody going to invite you someplace that's not your format? So it all has to kind of come together and make sense.
Yeah. Okay. So you get a lot more benefit out of this than just the cash you receive.
Correct.
You might receive, tens and tens of thousands of dollars more of value in all these amazing trips that you get to take.
Yep.
Yeah, I love that. So as you're picking a podcast, you might pick something that what you're going to receive in trade or comps from the businesses that want you to talk about them. Make sure that that is something you want to receive and you find value in.
Well, with my format, it's the opposite way around. If somebody wants me to talk about that destination, they're pitching me a trip or something. There are other formats, for instance, in the travel space, you get the people who are doing miles and points who are going to talk about things where people are going to click through to products or something like that. But yeah, you're matching the content with the value. But not always. Most of the episodes that I'm doing are because somebody said, hey, I was just we were talking about Brazil, for instance, beforehand. I might get somebody who says, I'm your expert. I'm your person who can tell you about a 1-week itinerary in Brazil. And so I'll have them on the show, and I'm not paying them anything. They're not paying me anything. We just think the audience would be interested in this story. And most of the shows are that. That's really, how you build your audience is you're giving the audience something that they want. So,
yeah.
And also that means you turn down trips too, because you're like, I can't, my audience wouldn't be interested in that.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't fit my format.
So earlier I mentioned that you were on 50 shows, but you corrected me on a few things. And I think my data may not be accurate here.
Okay.
How many countries have you been to?
It depends a little bit how you count, but let's say 75.
Okay. Of those 75 countries, which was your favorite?
Well, I like mine, actually. I'm a big fan of the U.S., a little less so lately, but that's probably still one of my favorite countries where I live here. But of other countries that I've been to, all of them, but probably, I think we were saying before we started recording, I was telling you Botswana. I went on a safari experience in Botswana where someone said, if you can get yourself here, I'll get you on a safari. And we went out on, for instance, a hunt with wild dogs, where we were chasing wild dogs as they were going on a hunt. It was just amazing experience. For history, as I'm a huge history buff, you're being in Egypt at the Great Pyramids, and they're telling you that the people who conquered the Old Kingdom had an advantage because they had the wheel, and you just, you're pick up your jaw off the floor here. How could this be that the people who built this didn't have chariots, didn't have a wheel? And that's amazing. And then I think Jordan was the other place that I had listed. I had just an amazing opportunity. It was back in 2014 where the Jordanian Tourism Board said, we want you to come and talk about Jordan. I was there for 10 days with a guide and driver, and we drove just all over the country. We went to Crusader castles and Roman ruins, and Petra, which a lot of people have heard of, that was in Indiana Jones. But it was just amazing experience, a variety of experiences of the places we did there. Swimming in the Dead Sea, canyoneering up a canyon. Did that in the wrong order, though. You shouldn't do the canyoneering first and getting all scraped up and then go swim the Dead Sea. That turns out that's a really bad idea.
And that's why you need a good travel podcaster to teach you those.
Exactly. Oh, and you talked about stories, that you like stories. While I was there, they said, we just heard that the Pope is coming to Jordan while you're here. Would you, not the current Pope, obviously, would you be willing to go hear him speak at a stadium in Amman, Jordan? And I'm not Catholic, but he's an interesting fellow. I said, sure. When somebody is bringing you there for 10 days, the appropriate response is, sure, I would be glad to do whatever you need. And they change of plans. No, sorry. We're going to get you press credentials, and you're going to go be with all the press photographers as the Pope and the royal family visit the baptism site for Jesus. Is that okay? So I have press credentials from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and stood there for a day with the photographers from API and all sorts of other news outlets. It was a fascinating, although really boring experience, and sitting in there in the sun waiting for things to happen. But very interesting to get a peek into the life of a photojournalist.
Today's episode of Podcasting Secrets is brought to you by Pod Allies, the done-for-you podcasting services solution. When I speak with CEOs about their podcast, one of the most common comments that I hear is that they know they need a podcast, but they don't have time. Have you ever wondered how some businesses find a way to still run their podcasts while juggling their crazy day-to-day operations? The secret might be simpler than you think. Let me introduce you to Pod Allies. This is a service that's changed the game for businesses in the podcasting world. Pod Allies is a done-for-you podcast production and marketing service. They understand that while many businesses understand the immense value podcasting can have for their business, finding time to produce, syndicate, promote, and monetize a show can be challenging. Pod Allies offers a dedicated team to handle virtually all aspects of your podcast production. From strategy and branding to audio and video editing and guest scheduling, they've got you covered. They even take care of creating blog posts, transcripts, and syndicating your content across multiple platforms. What sets Pod Allies apart is their use of PodUp, their proprietary podcasting software suite. This allows them to streamline the entire podcasting process, saving you time, effort, and a bunch of money. If you're ready to become a thought leader, connect with your audience, and grow your business through podcasting without all of the investment of time and cost of doing it yourself, Pod Allies might be the perfect solution for you. To learn more or to schedule a free consultation with a podcast expert, visit podallies.com. That's PODALLIES.com. Now back to the show. Having recorded more than 2,000 episodes, and a lot of these being interview style episodes, I'm sure you've mastered some skills in creating great interviews with great value. Would you be willing to share with us some of those skills? Teach us how we can conduct great interviews.
I hope I've gotten good at it. The big thing for me, so I had a radio consultant say one time and tell me I was doing it all wrong. Contacted me and said, listen to your show. You're doing it all wrong. The show needs to be more about you. You need to talk more. You should never let your guest talk for more than 2 minutes. You need to put in your 2 cents. You know, people need to go away and they need to know that this is your show. And I completely rejected all of that advice because the show is not about my trip and it's not about my guest's trip. It's about my listener's trip.
Yeah, that's profound.
So the real question is, what are you doing that can bring change to your listener or that helps your listener? So if you're talking about business, how are you affecting their business, right? If you're talking about psychology, how are you changing their lives? If you're talking about podcasting, how is their podcast getting better?
Yeah. What's in it for them?
What's in it for them?
That's true. They really don't care about us.
No.
They care about,
and why should they really?
How our shows can help them.
We're nice guys.
Yeah. Well,
but honestly,
most of the time.
Yeah. It's really more about what's in it for them. What can they learn? How are they entertained? You know, depending on what it is you're trying to deliver. So, and it's probably one of the reasons why I find radio boring is that, you know, that's what the radio consultants are telling you to do. So,
yeah. Yeah. Okay. So 2,000 episodes in, almost 20 years in, what is your secret sauce? What are the most important secrets that have made you successful?
Luck. I don't know if there are any secrets. Not quitting. I mean, honestly, so my goal was when I started, I said, I'm going to give myself 4 weeks off a year. I mentioned that earlier. I was going to do 48 episodes a year, weekly episodes. They come out Saturday morning, 7 a.m. Pacific time. Over the course of 20 years, coming up on 20 years in July, I have almost exactly met that goal. I think I'm probably 47 and change episodes per year. So every week, 7 a.m. on Saturday, an Amateur Traveler episode comes out. Every week, and 4 times a year, it's a repeat episode, but there's always an episode coming out. And now there's some bonus episodes that might come out also on a Wednesday, but probably about once a month. Bible study podcast every week, 5 a.m. Thursday Pacific time, an episode comes out. And I find when I take a break, when I am going on a big trip and I've done, 4 episodes of a Bible study podcast in a row and did one of my 4 weeks off, it's hard to get started again. It's easier to just keep going. As somebody who is motivated by deadlines, not quitting is where most of podcasts, as you know, don't make it to 10 episodes. The vast majority of podcasts never make 10 episodes. And so just keeping going is not really very much of a secret, but it is really very hard for most people to do.
Yeah. So you're saying most of us aren't going to be Joe Rogan before 10 episodes?
Most of us are not going to be Joe Rogan even at 10 episodes. Yeah. No.
But
most of us aren't going to be Joe Rogan, period. So,
yeah. But at 20 episodes, I've got a shot, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Definitely. What is one of the biggest?
Tend to be a slow growth area.
Yeah.
Some people grow faster. We had friends who've done more, put more money into it, for instance, done more promotion than I've ever done and grown things faster, but it doesn't tend to be a viral growth kind of media, but it also tends to be sticky. I do a travel podcast. I was doing it in COVID and my numbers for listens per new episodes didn't really go down. People weren't traveling.
Yeah.
So, but it's sticky.
But they were dreaming of traveling.
They were dreaming of traveling. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. They were sitting there at home thinking of all the wonderful places they would like to go work from home.
Yeah, exactly.
In theory. What is one of the biggest challenges that you've faced as a podcaster, and how'd you get through it?
I think that was the biggest challenge is keeping going.
Not quitting. Yeah.
Well, because I've been doing, so the other thing I didn't say is I did this with a full-time job. So sometimes I would say 20 years of my career, I've been working at startup companies. So, basically working more than 40 hours a week, doing whatever I was doing during the day, and then coming home and doing 2 or more podcasts, also getting those out and trying to keep 2 or more blogs active at the same time. It is definitely one of those where people say, how do you do that? And I say, sleep is for the weak. Okay. But I mean, that is the hardest thing. The hardest thing is keep coming up with ideas. In my case, if you're doing interviews, you've really got to work in advance, right? You can't just be saying, I'm going to do an interview this week for this week, because something's going to fall through. This is our 3rd time to try and record this episode because things happen on one side or the other, right? Gosh, someone just got sick, something just broke or whatever. So trying to juggle, if you're doing an interview show, that stream of interviews, and also having the ability to say, that one didn't work. I don't want to release that episode. That interview wasn't good enough. You really have to have a few extras in there too. And just keeping that going consistently is a grind. It does take some effort.
That's a hard thing to do. I had a podcaster do that to me once, and I was thoroughly embarrassed. I've had to do that, I think, twice with my guests. And
you've had to
not publish episodes.
It's very hard.
How often have you not published an episode you've recorded?
I would say it happens probably once every 6 months or so.
Yeah.
You have somebody on. I don't have a producer, and so I don't do the pre-calls that some podcasts are able to do, where you're basically screening someone to see if they can tell a story. And so it'll be for a variety of reasons. I've had people I'd love to have back on, but they didn't know that destination well enough. Or I've had friends who've come on and, I say, well, okay, we're going to go to this city. What would you do? Well, I would just walk around. Okay, but that makes a really boring episode.
Yeah,
I'm really looking for specific recommendations. You didn't really do your homework. And so I can't use this. I've talked to people for 20 minutes about Iceland and learned that the beer was expensive and you should go to the Blue Lagoon. That's just not enough content in there. And I'm not going to do another episode on Iceland for a while, so I'm not going to put this one out and pretend that it's a good one. And there's a few that I put out that were on the bubble that maybe I shouldn't have too.
Yeah. But you have to do that, even though it's hard, because you have to protect the value you give to your audience.
Right.
A lot of podcasters think that, well, this podcast is free, so it doesn't cost anybody.
Right. But
it really does, because if it's a half an hour episode, they're trading a half an hour of their life for it.
Right.
And you have to give enough value that it's worth trading that half an hour.
Exactly. Yeah.
What advice would you give to yourself 20 years ago? You're thinking of starting your first podcast. What would you wish you would have known back then?
It's funny. I don't know that there was anything, at this point, it would all be encouragement, do it, because I can't imagine my life would be just very different had I not done it. I don't know if there was any big piece of advice that was basically, well, other than the fact that, my original format was stupid, but that's definitely one of the reasons why I tell people, just make sure that what you're planning to do, come up with 20 episodes, right? Do you have an idea that is going to work in the long term? Because if you can only come up with 5 episodes, you've got 5 episodes. You don't have a long-term podcast. And I didn't do that at first. I was thinking, hey, I'll just do my travel. And it wasn't a good idea. Unfortunately, I was able to pivot. But that's one of the reasons I give that advice. And the other advice about, making sure that what you're providing the audience, what you're trying to get out of it, and your content all makes sense together, is that has come from experience. And, nobody told me that to start with, but that would have been nice to know.
Yeah. Do you have a secret that's worked for you about how to grow and promote your podcast?
No. So, right now, I would say the number one way your podcast is going to grow is through podcasts, right? So if you're on other shows, that's a good way. I say yes to everybody, basically. We've got 5 listeners. Great. Maybe someday you'll have 10. Yeah. So
that's right. And we'll listen to the back episodes.
We'll go listen to the back episodes. But basically, the social media is hard to build podcasts that way. Email. If you're a company and you've got newsletters and things like that, absolutely promote it every way. But the number one way is, doing feed exchanges with other podcasts where you're putting one of their episodes on yours and on your feed, and putting your episode on one of their feeds, or having people on so that they're going to promote it to their audience, making them sound good so they want to promote it to their audience.
Yeah.
All of those sorts of things.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. And so they recommend their friends. So they say, hey, Chris, Chris will make you sound good.
Chris, you talked about how your life is so much different because of this podcasting journey that you've gone on.
Right.
Will you share with us what are some of the greatest benefits that you've received in your life from podcasting?
So last June, I mentioned that I retired. I am a little young to retire. I'm in my 60s, but I am not 67. I'm not collecting Social Security. I basically didn't retire because I didn't like my job. I was a director of engineering at American Express, enjoyed what I was doing, was getting paid well. But I had these opportunities, which I had to say no to because I didn't have the time. And it helped that American Express had bought a company that I was at, a 6-person company. So there was some extra cash that helped retire a little early too. But basically it was, I already have 2 full-time jobs. I'm a podcaster, blogger, and then I had another job. But that other job while it was great, I was being drawn to all of the opportunities that were available if I spent my time doing full-time blogging and podcasting. So the kind of trips that I go on, the kind of freedom that I have now, that I still have that deadline, right? Every week I still have to make the donuts, but I have a lot more flexibility in my life because I worked towards this for 19 years, right? I built a retirement job, as it were.
Yeah.
And it's not just amateur travel. So the amateur travel gives me that. Bible study podcast is obviously a very different sort of payoff. Don't make as much money on that. Don't intend to make as much money on that. But I teach a Bible study to about 4,000 to 5,000 people a day.
Yeah.
And, that ability to have an impact, the letters that I get from Amateur Traveler are fun. Hey, we never thought about going to Nicaragua until we heard your episode. Now we're honeymooning there. That sort of things are pretty cool. The letters I get for Bible Study Podcast are, you changed my life.
Yeah.
They're a very different level of impact that it is a privilege to be able to have. And it's still honestly really surprising. It's just not something I would have pictured. Just couldn't have imagined.
Yeah. So the Bible Study Podcast is your social contribution, your chance to have a voice. I do the same thing. I have 2 shows. This is my business one, and then I have a faith-based one as well.
Mm-hmm. The word blessed in the background was kind of a hint there, but
yeah. Earlier, you mentioned that people don't usually get rich super quick off of a podcast. It's not a
People don't usually get rich from a podcast, so we could stop right there. And the average amount of listeners for podcasts is pretty small. For if you take all podcasts out there, it's somewhere about 200 downloads per episode. That's quite a curve. And I know that my show, by the time you get to 14, 15,000 downloads per episode, is somewhere like the 97th percentile for podcasts. So
congratulations.
I would say that you go into podcasting because it's something you love, not because you intend to get rich. The people who go in to get rich, I think it's a fool's errand for most people.
Yeah. So you talked about that it's not a get rich quick strategy.
Yep.
But it's now your retirement strategy. Isn't
that funny?
Yeah. Well,
yeah. I make less money than I did as a director of engineering at American Express, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But you're getting a lot more benefit in all these trips and traveling that you're being able to do. It's the opportunity cost that made you jump and go do this full time. So even though podcasting may not be a get rich quick scheme, it may be a long-term retirement strategy, and if you pick the right niche, it could potentially be something that helps you create a life that you really want.
Well, and it did that even before I retired, obviously. It led to additional funds, but it also led to additional opportunities, and it led to just amazing opportunities that I could have never predicted in both places, in both formats.
Perfect. Okay, Chris, if our audience has enjoyed this podcast as I have, and they want to learn more about you and your work, what are the best ways for them to do that?
Most of my travel you can find linked to amateurtraveler.com, a couple different sites, but they're all linked from there. And then obviously for faith-based stuff, I'd send you over to thebiblestudypodcast.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing so much value with us today.
Thanks for having me.